Snow fell hard over the northern hills, and a woman ran through it with torn shoes and a white gown soaked to gray. Her breath came out in sharp clouds. Behind her, far off but not far enough, she could hear horses. She did not look back. She only ran until her legs gave out and the cold ground rose up to meet her. Duke Alaric Voss was riding home alone that night, later than he meant to be, after a meeting that had gone nowhere good. The talks with House Draven had ended the way they always ended, with cold words and colder silence. He wanted nothing more than a warm fire and an end to the day. The storm had other plans. It grew thicker with every mile, until the road in front of him nearly disappeared under white. That was when his horse stopped on its own, ears pinned back, refusing to move forward. Alaric leaned down, ready to scold the animal, and then he saw why it had stopped. A shape lay just off the road, half buried already, a pale hand reaching out from a fold of white fabric. He was on the ground before he had time to think about it. He knelt beside her and pulled the snow away from her face. She was young, her lips nearly blue, her wrists marked with rope burns that had not yet healed. Around her neck hung a small pendant, and even in the dark he recognized the crest carved into it. It belonged to House Draven, the family his own house had been at war with in every way but open battle for as long as he could remember. For one long moment, he almost let go of her. Old instinct told him to ride on, to leave whatever this was to whoever had left her here. But her chest still rose and fell, faint and uneven, and something in him refused to accept the easy choice. He was not a man who left people to die in the snow, whatever crest they wore around their neck. He gathered her into his arms. She weighed almost nothing, as if the cold had already begun to take pieces of her away. He wrapped his own cloak around her and lifted her onto his horse, holding her steady in front of him as he turned back toward home. The wind tried to push them off the road more than once. He kept his arm locked around her and did not loosen it, not even when his fingers went numb from the cold. The ride back to Voss Hall felt longer than any ride he had taken in years. He watched her face the whole way, searching for some sign that she was still fighting to stay alive. Once her eyes fluttered halfway open, unfocused and frightened before closing again. He spoke to her without thinking, low and steady, telling her to hold on, that they were close, that she was not going to die in a snowbank on his land. He did not know if she could hear him. He kept talking anyway. When the towers of Voss Hall finally came into view through the storm, lit by torches at the gate, Alaric felt something in his chest loosen for the first time since he had found her. He shouted for the gate to open before he was even close enough for the guards to hear him clearly, and by the time his horse clattered into the courtyard, servants were already running out with lanterns raised against the snow. "Get Martha," he called out, swinging down from the saddle with the woman still held against him. "Now, tell her to bring blankets and hot water and clear the east chamber." The old steward, Grady, took one look at the woman in his master's arms and did not ask questions. He simply moved, shouting orders of his own, and within minutes the whole household was awake and working. Fires were built up, water was heated, a bed was stripped and remade with warm linens. Alaric carried her through the halls himself, past startled faces that knew better than to ask why their duke had returned from a diplomatic ride, with a half-frozen stranger in his arms. He laid her down as gently as he could on the bed in the east chamber, and stepped back only when Martha, the head of his household staff, arrived with an armful of blankets and a look on her face that told him to get out of the way. "She is freezing, my lord," Martha said, already working to peel away the wet gown with quick, practical hands. "Another hour out there and this would be a very different night." "Will she live?" Alaric asked. He stood near the door, unwilling to leave despite Martha's pointed looks. "That depends on the next few hours. Her breathing is weak, but it is there." "Someone did this to her, my lord. Look at her wrists." Alaric had already seen them. The rope marks were fresh, angry red lines against pale skin, and there were faint bruises along one arm that had nothing to do with the cold. Whatever had happened to this woman before she ended up alone in a snowstorm, it had not been an accident. "I know," he said quietly. "I saw the pendant around her neck before you took it off. It belongs to House Draven." Martha's hands stilled for just a moment before she went back to her work. She did not need to say what they were both thinking. Everyone in the household knew the history between the Voss family and House Draven, a feud that had outlived the men who started it and had poisoned 2 generations since. Bringing a Draven woman into Voss Hall, injured and unconscious, was not a small thing. It was the kind of thing that could be twisted into an act of war if the wrong story reached the wrong ears. "Does anyone else know she is here?" Martha asked, wrapping another blanket around the woman's shivering shoulders. "No one saw us on the road. The storm saw to that." Alaric moved closer, watching the woman's face as color slowly, painfully slowly, began to return to her lips. "I want it kept that way for now. Only the people in this room and whoever you trust enough to bring in to help her." Martha nodded once, understanding without needing further explanation. She had served the Voss family long enough to know when her duke was making a decision that could not be easily undone. They worked through the night to bring the woman back from the edge of the cold that had nearly claimed her. Warm cloths were pressed against her hands and feet. Broth was carefully spooned between her lips when she was calm enough to swallow. Alaric did not sleep. He sat in a chair near the window, watching the storm rage outside and the fragile rise and fall of her breathing inside, and he found himself thinking about questions that had no easy answers. Who had tied her wrists? Why she had been out in a blizzard in a wedding gown, of all things, torn and filthy as it was. Why a woman connected to House Draven, a family that had never shown his own anything but contempt, was the one lying in his guest bed instead of safe in whatever home she had been meant to have. Somewhere near dawn, as the storm finally began to weaken outside the windows, the woman's breathing steadied into something closer to normal sleep. Martha, exhausted but satisfied, finally allowed herself to sit down in the chair across from Alaric. "She will live, my lord. I am certain of it now. Whatever brought her to that road, the cold did not win tonight." "Good," Alaric said, and meant it more than the single word could carry. "When she wakes, I want to know everything she remembers. Gently. She has clearly been through enough without anyone treating her like a prisoner in this house too. And if word gets out that she is here." Alaric was quiet for a long moment, watching the first gray light of morning creep over the frost-covered hills outside. He thought of the pendant Martha had set aside on the table, the crest of a family that had brought nothing but bitterness to his own for as long as he could remember. He thought of the rope marks on the woman's wrists, marks that spoke of something far darker than a simple accident on a winter road. "Then we will deal with it," he said finally. "But not before she has had the chance to tell her own story. Everyone deserves that much, even an enemy's bride." He did not know yet how much those words would come to matter, or how far they would carry him from the life he had known before that storm. All he knew, sitting there in the gray light of a new morning with a stranger's fate suddenly tangled with his own, was that he had made his choice the moment he stopped his horse in the snow. Whatever came next, he would face it having done the one thing he could not have lived with failing to do. Outside, the wind finally began to die down, leaving behind a world blanketed in fresh white silence, as if the storm itself were holding its breath to see what would happen next. Elena opened her eyes to a ceiling she did not know. For a long moment she simply lay still, watching the play of firelight against wooden beams, trying to understand why her whole body ached, and why the air around her smelled of wood smoke instead of the cold she remembered. Then the memory of the night before rushed back all at once, and she sat up so quickly that pain shot through her stiff limbs. "Easy now," said a woman's voice, calm but firm. "You are safe. You are not going anywhere fast, not after the night you had." Elena turned toward the voice and saw an older woman with graying hair pulled back neatly, sitting in a chair near the bed with a cup of something warm in her hands. The woman's face was kind, but there was a sharpness in her eyes that suggested she missed very little. "Where am I?" Elena's voice came out cracked and thin. Her throat felt raw as if she had swallowed ice itself. "You are at Voss Hall," the woman said, watching her carefully. "My name is Martha. I run this household. You were found half frozen on the road last night, and my lord the Duke brought you here himself." The words landed like a stone dropped into still water. Voss Hall, the Duke. Alina's mind, still foggy from cold and exhaustion, took a moment to fully understand what that meant, and when it did, fear rose up her throat faster than the pain had. Voss, she repeated, her hands gripping the blanket tightly. This is House Voss. It is. Alina's breath came faster. Everything she had ever been told about the Voss family rose up in her mind at once, stories passed down through her own household like warnings whispered to frighten children into obedience. The Voss family were the enemies of House Draven, had been for 2 generations, ever since a border dispute had turned into something far uglier that neither family had ever fully explained to her. She had grown up hearing that the Voss men were cold, ruthless, willing to use anyone against her family if it served their purpose. And now she was lying in their house, in their bed wearing clothes she did not recognize, utterly at their mercy. I need to leave, she said, trying to push the blankets away despite the way her whole body protested the movement. Please, I cannot be here. If anyone learns I am here, it will be used against my family, against everyone You are not leaving this bed today, Martha said, setting down her cup and moving to gently but firmly press Alina back against the pillows. Not with the fever you had last night, and not with feet that were nearly frostbitten when we brought you in. You will do yourself no favors collapsing in another snowbank. An hour after this one let you go. Alina wanted to argue, but her body betrayed her, trembling with the effort of simply sitting up. She sank back against the pillows, tears of frustration and fear pricking at her eyes. You do not understand. This is not my home to be safe in. Your Duke's family and mine have hated each other for years, if he learns who I really am. He already knows, Martha said quietly. He saw the pendant around your neck before I removed it to warm you. He knew exactly whose crest it bore when he lifted you onto his horse in the middle of that storm. Alina went very still, and he brought me here anyway. He did. For a long moment, Alina did not know what to say. Nothing in the stories she had grown up with had prepared her for the idea that a Voss, especially the Duke himself, would carry an unconscious stranger, wearing his enemy's crest through a blizzard rather than leave her to whatever fate the storm intended. It did not fit with anything she thought she understood about this family, and the confusion of it left her more unsettled than the fear had. Why, she finally asked, would he do that? Martha's expression softened slightly, though her sharp eyes did not lose their watchfulness. You would have to ask him that yourself. But I have served this family a long time, child, and whatever you have been told about the Voss name, the man who found you last night is not the villain your family's stories likely painted him to be. Now, rest. There will be time for questions once you have eaten something, and your fever has fully broken. Alina did not feel capable of resting, not with her thoughts spinning as fast as they were, but exhaustion won out over fear in the end. She drifted in and out of uneasy sleep through the morning, waking each time to find broth or warm water waiting for her, and each time Martha or a quiet young maid named Ivy tending to the fire or changing the cloths on her healing wrists. It was nearly evening when the door opened and a tall man stepped into the room, and Alina knew immediately, without being told, exactly who he was. Duke Alaric Voss did not look like the monster from her family's stories. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with dark hair still slightly damp as if he had recently washed away the last traces of the storm, and there was an exhaustion around his eyes that suggested he had not slept much either. He stopped a respectful distance from the bed, his expression unreadable but not unkind. You are awake, he said. I am glad to see it. You gave us all a difficult night. Alina straightened as much as her aching body would allow, pulling the blanket a little higher as though it might offer some kind of protection. You are the Duke. Alaric Voss, he confirmed with a small nod. And you are, I believe, connected to House Draven, though I do not yet know your name or how you came to be alone on my land in the middle of a storm. There was no accusation in his tone, only a quiet, careful curiosity, but Alina still hesitated. Old fears did not disappear simply because the man standing in front of her did not match the cruel picture she had been given. My name is Alina, she said finally. "Alina Draven. I am the daughter of Lord Draven's late brother." Something flickered across Alaric's face at the name, gone too quickly for Alina to fully read it. "And the wedding gown Martha tells me you were found wearing." Alina's hands twisted in the blanket. The memory of the night before came back sharp and painful, the candle-lit hall, the cold eyes of the man she had been told to call her future husband, the moment she had understood with terrible clarity exactly what kind of arrangement she had been sold into. "I was to be married last night," she said quietly, "to Lord Edmund Draven, my uncle's chosen heir, though not by blood." Alaric's expression did not change, but something in the set of his shoulders grew more attentive. "Your uncle arranged a marriage for his own niece to his heir." "It was meant to secure the succession," Alina said, the bitterness she had been holding back finally slipping into her voice. "My father died when I was young, and the land that should have passed through his line was left to me, since I had no brothers. My uncle could not simply take it without cause, not without the other noble families raising questions. But if I married Edmund, the man he had chosen to inherit everything else, the land would fold neatly back into the family, no questions asked, no laws broken." "And you did not want this marriage?" "I did not know the full truth of it until the night before the ceremony," Alina admitted, her voice growing quieter. "A servant I trusted overheard my uncle and Edmund discussing what would happen to me once the marriage was finalized and the land was secured. They did not intend for me to remain a burden to anyone for very long after that." The room went very still. Alaric's jaw tightened, though his voice remained carefully even when he spoke again. "You are saying they meant you harm." "I am saying I ran the moment I understood what my life was worth to them once I had served my purpose," Alina said, and for the first time since waking, her composure cracked, tears slipping free despite her effort to hold them back. "I climbed out through a window during the wedding preparations and ran into the storm with nothing but the gown on my back, because staying felt more dangerous than freezing to death in the snow. I did not expect to survive the night, my lord. I certainly did not expect to wake up in the house of my family's enemies, cared for as though I mattered to someone." Alaric was quiet for a long moment, and when he finally spoke, his voice had lost the careful distance it held before. "You do matter, Alina Draven, whatever name you carry. No person deserves to be treated as property to be used and discarded, whatever house they were born into." He paused, seeming to weigh his next words carefully. "I will not pretend the history between our families does not complicate this. But you came into my care as someone in need, not as an enemy, and that is how you will be treated here for as long as you require shelter." Alina stared at him, unable to fully reconcile the man in front of her with everything she had been raised to believe about the Voss name. "Why would you help me? I am the last person your family owes anything to." "Perhaps," Alaric said, a faint, tired smile touching his mouth for the first time. "Or perhaps the stories our families tell about each other have never been the whole truth on either side. I intend to find out which. For now, you should rest. There will be difficult decisions to make in the days ahead about how to keep you safe and what to do about the people searching for you. But tonight, you need only worry about getting well." He left her with that, closing the door quietly behind him, and Alina sat alone in the flickering firelight for a long time afterward, turning his words over in her mind. Everything she had been taught about the Voss family had prepared her for cruelty, for cold calculation, for an enemy who would see her only as a tool to use against her uncle. Instead, she had found a man who had risked his own household safety to save a stranger wearing his enemy's crest, who spoke to her with more honesty and care in a single conversation than her own family had shown her in years. She did not know yet what to make of it. But for the first time since she had climbed out that window into the storm, she allowed herself to feel something other than fear. It was small and fragile, and she was not ready to call it hope. But it was there, warming some quiet corner of her, the way the fire in the hearth pushed back the last of winter's cold from the room. Outside, the snow had finally stopped falling, leaving the world outside her window hushed and white, and somewhere beyond the walls of Voss Hall, she knew, her uncle and the man she had nearly been forced to marry were almost certainly beginning to search for her. But for tonight at least, she was warm, she was safe, and she was, against every expectation she had carried into that storm, alive. 3 days passed before Alina was strong enough to leave the bed for more than a few minutes at a time, and in that time, Voss Hall changed around her in ways she had not expected. Word had gone quietly through the household that a guest was recovering in the east chamber, but only a handful of trusted servants knew who that guest truly was. Grady, the old steward, kept the household running with the same steady calm he always did, giving no outward sign that anything unusual was happening within the walls he managed. Martha oversaw Alina's care personally, refusing to let any but her most loyal staff near the east chamber. Even Ivy, the young maid who brought meals and tended the fire, had been sworn to silence with a seriousness that told Alina exactly how much danger her presence represented, even if no one said the words aloud. Alaric visited each evening, always briefly, always with careful questions about how she was healing, though Alina began to notice that his visits lasted a little longer each time, and that the conversation drifted further from her health and further into subjects that had nothing to do with recovery at all. "You do not eat like someone raised in a great house," he observed one evening, watching as she finished a bowl of stew with more enthusiasm than the delicate manners her uncle's household had tried to drill into her over the years. Alina flushed slightly, setting down her spoon. "My father raised me on a smaller estate before he died. We did not have the resources for elaborate meals or elaborate manners. After he passed and my uncle took over my guardianship, I learned to blend into whatever room I was placed in, but old habits do not disappear so easily." "I did not mean it as criticism," Alaric said, something like amusement flickering across his tired features. "It is a relief, honestly, after years of formal dinners where half the guests seem more interested in performing wealth than enjoying their food. Is that what life is like in a duke's household? Performances. More often than I would like." He settled into the chair near her bed, the one that had become almost a permanent fixture over the past 3 evenings. "My father used to say that titles are a kind of stage, and everyone born to one learns to act a part whether they want to or not. I have spent most of my life trying to figure out where the performance ends and the man underneath begins." Alina studied him for a moment, surprised by the honesty in his words. It was not the kind of thing she had expected a duke, especially this duke, to admit so freely to a stranger recovering in his guest bed. "And have you figured it out?" "Some days," he admitted. "Other days less so." He seemed to catch himself then, as though he had said more than he intended, and cleared his throat. "How are your wrists healing? Martha mentioned the marks were deep." Alina glanced down at the fading rope burns, the memory of the night of her wedding rising up unwelcome and sharp. "Better. They still ache in the cold, but they are healing." "Good." His voice hardened slightly, the warmth of a moment before giving way to something colder and more focused. "I would like to understand more about what happened that night, if you are willing to speak of it. Not for my own curiosity alone, but because I believe the more we understand about your uncle's plans, the better prepared we will be to protect you from them." Alina hesitated, but the steadiness in his gaze, the same steadiness that had carried her through a blizzard 3 nights before, gave her the courage to continue. "My uncle has always resented that my father's portion of the family lands passed to me rather than reverting to him upon my father's death. Under the old laws, a daughter can only hold land in her own name if she remains unmarried, or if her husband agrees to specific terms protecting her inheritance. My uncle used that loophole against me. He arranged the marriage to Edmund not to secure my future, but to erase it. Once I was married, the land would legally transfer into Edmund's control, and from there back into my uncle's influence, since Edmund owes every advantage he has ever had to my uncle's patronage. And once the land transferred," Alaric said slowly, understanding dawning in his expression, "you would no longer serve any purpose to either of them." "That is what I overheard the night before the wedding," Alina confirmed, her voice dropping. "Edmund asking my uncle what was to be done with me once the papers were signed. My uncle said something about arranging an unfortunate accident once enough time had passed that no one would think to connect it to the wedding. He said it so calmly, my lord, as though he were discussing what to do with an old piece of furniture rather than his own brother's daughter. The silence that followed was heavy. Alaric's hands had curled into fists on the arms of his chair, though his voice remained carefully controlled when he spoke again. Do you have any proof of this conversation? Any witness, any document? Only my own word, and the word of the servant who first warned me, though she fled the estate the same night I did, and I do not know where she is now. Alina's eyes filled with tears. She quickly blinked away, unwilling to let herself fall apart in front of him again. No one will believe me over my uncle. He is respected, wealthy, careful. I am simply the niece who ran from her own wedding in what everyone will assume was foolishness or fear of marriage itself, not evidence of anything more serious. I believe you, Alaric said quietly, and something in the certainty of his voice settled some of the panic rising in her chest. I have had dealings with your uncle before, Alina. I know exactly the kind of careful cruelty he is capable of. It does not surprise me in the least that he would arrange something like this and expect to walk away from it without consequence. You have dealings with House Draven. More than I would like, Alaric said with a tired half-smile. Our two houses share a border, and border disputes have a way of dragging families into each other's business, whether they wish to be involved or not. I met with your uncle 3 days ago, in fact, the very night I found you. The negotiations, as they usually do, ended poorly. Alina stared at him, the strange coincidence of it settling uneasily in her mind. You met with my uncle the night you found me freezing on your land. I did. I did not put the two events together until I saw the pendant around your neck and realized whose wedding must have been happening that same night, in the same region I had just left. He shook his head slightly, as though still turning the coincidence over in his own mind. Fate has a strange sense of timing, it would seem. Their conversation was interrupted then by a soft knock at the door, and Martha slipped inside with an expression that immediately put both of them on alert. My lord, there is a rider at the gate. He says he comes from House Draven, asking whether any traveler has been seen on the northern road in recent days. Alina's blood went cold. Alaric was on his feet immediately, his relaxed posture from moments before replaced entirely by the sharp, controlled focus of a man used to handling crisis. Does he suspect anything specific, or is this simply a general inquiry? He claims it is routine, checking with all the neighboring estates after a guest of Lord Draven's went missing during a family celebration. But he is watching the household closely as he speaks, my lord. I do not think his questions are as idle as he wants them to seem. Keep him at the gate. Offer him refreshment, delay him as long as you reasonably can without raising suspicion, and make certain none of the newer staff go anywhere near this wing of the house while he remains on the grounds. Alaric turned back to Alina, his expression grave. You must stay perfectly silent and out of sight until he is gone. I know that is little comfort after everything you have already endured, but it is essential. Alina nodded, her heart pounding so hard she was certain it could be heard through the walls. I understand. Alaric left with Martha, and Alina sat alone in the flickering firelight, straining to hear any sound from below that might tell her what was happening at the gate. The minutes stretched unbearably long. She thought of Edmund's cold eyes at the wedding ceremony, of her uncle's calm voice discussing her death as though it were a minor administrative matter, and she pressed her hand against her mouth to keep from making any sound at all, even the sound of her own frightened breathing. It was nearly an hour before Alaric returned, and the moment she saw his face, some of the tension in her chest eased slightly. He is gone, he said, closing the door quietly behind him. Grady handled him well, told him no travelers had been seen on the northern road in days, given the severity of the storm, which was true enough that it did not require any real deception. The rider seemed satisfied enough, though I suspect this will not be the last inquiry we receive. They know I am somewhere out here, Alina said quietly. They will not stop looking. No, Alaric agreed, sitting back down in the chair beside her bed, though his posture remained tense in a way it had not been before the interruption. They will not. which means we cannot keep you hidden here indefinitely without significant risk, both to you and to this household. But we also cannot simply hand you back to a man who has already made clear what he intends for you once you have served your purpose." "Then what do we do?" Alaric was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire as though the answer might be found somewhere in the flickering flames. "I do not know yet," he admitted finally. "But I promise you this, Alina. I did not pull you out of that snow to hand you back to the people who put you there. Whatever we decide, it will not be that." Alina looked at him, this man she had been raised to fear, who had instead become the only person in weeks who seemed to genuinely care whether she lived or died, and felt something shift inside her chest that had nothing to do with fear at all. It was fragile and uncertain, this new feeling, but it was steadier than anything her old life had offered her. And for the first time since climbing out that window into the storm, she let herself believe that perhaps her future did not have to be as dark as it had seemed on the night she ran. Outside, the household settled slowly back into its evening routines, the near discovery folding quietly into the growing list of secrets Voss Hall now carried within its walls. But both Alina and Alaric understood, without needing to say it aloud, that the storm that had brought them together had only been the first of many they would need to weather before this was finally over. A week into her recovery, Alina was strong enough to walk the length of the east wing without growing breathless. Though Alaric still insisted, she remained within the private corridors where fewer eyes might notice an unfamiliar face. On a quiet afternoon, while pale winter sunlight filtered weakly through tall windows, she found herself in a small library she had not yet explored, drawn there by the sight of Alaric sitting alone near the fire with a book open on his lap that he did not appear to be reading. "May I join you?" she asked from the doorway, unsure whether she was intruding on a private moment. He looked up, and something in his expression, some old weight she had not seen in him before, made her hesitate, but he nodded, gesturing to the chair across from his own. "Please. I could use the company, honestly, more than the book." She settled into the offered chair, noticing now that the room was filled with portraits, generations of Voss ancestors staring down from gilded frames with varying degrees of solemnity. Her eyes were drawn to one in particular, a woman with dark hair and a gentle, warm expression that felt different from the stern formality of the others. "Is that your mother?" she asked softly. Alaric followed her gaze, and his jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Yes, Lady Isolde Voss." He was quiet for a long moment before continuing, his voice lower than usual. "She died when I was 12 years old." "I am sorry," Alina said, meaning it. "How did she pass?" He did not answer immediately, and Alina began to worry she had asked something too painful, something that crossed a line she had not meant to cross. But then he spoke, his eyes still fixed on the portrait rather than on her. "She was killed during a border skirmish. My father always told me it was simply the chaos of conflict, soldiers on both sides acting without clear orders, an accident of war rather than anything deliberate. I believed that story for most of my life." "But you no longer believe it," Alina said quietly, sensing where the conversation was heading before he spoke the words aloud. "3 years ago, I found letters among my father's private papers after his death. Correspondence between him and men who had served during that skirmish, men who had never spoken publicly about what happened that day." Alaric finally turned to look at her, and the pain in his eyes was old and deep, the kind that had been carried quietly for years without ever finding proper release. "The letters made clear that my mother's death was not an accident of chaos. She was traveling with a small escort near the border when they were deliberately targeted, ambushed by men working under the direction of your uncle's father. The man who led House Draven before your uncle inherited the title." Alina's breath caught. That cannot be. Why would anyone target a noblewoman traveling with a small escort? What purpose would that serve? "My mother was returning from a meeting she had arranged in secret, without my father's knowledge, with representatives from your family. She believed, foolishly perhaps, that she could end the feud between our houses through her own diplomacy, working around the stubbornness of both her husband and your family's patriarch. She believed she had found common ground, a path toward peace that neither side's pride would allow the men in charge to consider. His voice had grown rough with old grief. Your uncle's father discovered her efforts and decided that a peace negotiated by a woman, without his control or his terms, was a threat rather than an opportunity. So he had her removed from the situation entirely, in the most permanent way possible, and made certain it looked like nothing more than misfortune. Alina sat in stunned silence, the weight of this revelation settling over her slowly. I never knew any of this. My family never spoke of such things, not in any detail. I only knew that our two houses had hated each other for generations, without ever fully understanding why. Most people in both our households likely do not know the full truth, Alaric said. My father buried the details as deeply as he could, perhaps out of grief, perhaps out of fear of what open knowledge of the murder might have started between our families at the time. He chose quiet mourning over open conflict, though I have often wondered whether that choice was mercy or cowardice. I am so sorry, Alina said again, and this time the words carried the full weight of genuine grief, grief for a woman she had never known who had tried, in her own quiet way, to end the very feud that had nearly cost Alina her own life. Your mother sounds as though she deserved far better than what she received from either of our families. She did, Alaric's voice softened slightly. I think of her often, wondering what our two houses might look like now if her efforts had succeeded, if she had lived to see whatever peace she was working toward. Instead, her death only deepened the hatred between us, giving my father every reason to believe that House Draven could never be trusted, and giving your family's patriarch every reason to believe his ruthlessness had been justified and effective. Alina thought of her own father then, a man she remembered only faintly through the haze of childhood memory, gentle and quiet in a household that had grown increasingly cold and calculating under her uncle's influence after his death. My father died when I was young as well, she said quietly. I was told it was illness, a fever that took him quickly. But knowing what I now know about my uncle, about the way he speaks of removing inconvenient obstacles as though discussing nothing more serious than clearing brush from a field, I find myself wondering whether that story was entirely true either. Alaric's expression sharpened with sudden attention. Do you have reason to believe otherwise? Nothing concrete, Alina admitted. Only a feeling and the memory of overhearing servants whisper things they quickly silenced whenever I entered a room, back when I was still young enough that no one thought to guard their words as carefully around me. My father held land that would have passed fully to my uncle had I not existed. It would not surprise me to learn that my uncle's ambitions began long before the arrangement of my marriage to Edmund. The fire crackled softly between them, the only sound in the room for several long moments as both of them sat with the weight of families built on quiet violence and buried truths. Finally, Alaric spoke again, his voice steadier now, though still carrying the rawness of the conversation they had just shared. I have spent most of my adult life believing that peace between our houses was impossible, that the wound my mother's death left was simply too deep to ever properly heal. But sitting here with you now, hearing your own story, I find myself wondering whether the true enemy was ever really House Draven as a whole, or simply the men who have led it, generation after generation, each one more ruthless than the last. My uncle is not the whole of my family, Alina said softly. He is simply the one currently in power, the one who inherited both the title and, it seems, the willingness to use any means necessary to protect and expand it. There were others in my family, my father among them, who wanted nothing to do with the feud at all, who simply wished to live quietly and raise their children in peace. Then perhaps, Alaric said, something like cautious hope entering his tired voice for the first time, the feud was never truly between our houses at all, but between the ambitions of a few dangerous men who found the conflict useful for their own purposes. Men like your uncle, and men like the Draven patriarch who ordered my mother's death. Alina considered this for a long moment, turning the idea over carefully in her mind. It was a strange kind of comfort to think that the hatred she had grown up believing was inevitable, woven into the very blood of both their families, might instead be something far more fragile, something built and maintained deliberately by men with their own selfish reasons for keeping the wound open rather than allowing it to heal. If that is true, she said finally, then perhaps it is possible for people like us, people who never wanted this conflict in the first place, to choose something different. Alaric held her gaze for a long moment, something unspoken passing between them that neither seemed quite ready to name aloud. "I would like to believe that," he said quietly. "I would like to believe that very much." The conversation drifted after that into quieter territory, memories of childhood before either of them had fully understood the weight of the families they were born into. Small stories that had nothing to do with feuds or fathers or the dangerous men currently searching the countryside for a missing bride. Alina found herself laughing for the first time in longer than she could remember. A real laugh, unguarded and warm, at a story Alaric told about accidentally setting fire to his tutor's favorite chair as a child while attempting to demonstrate a particularly ambitious theory about how flint worked. By the time evening fell and Martha arrived to remind Alina that she should rest before another long day of recovery, something had shifted quietly between them, something neither of them fully understood yet, but both could feel settling into place, steady and warm, despite the danger still gathering outside the walls of Voss Hall. As Alina finally drifted toward sleep that night, her mind returned again and again to the portrait of Alaric's mother, to the quiet courage of a woman who had tried to end a feud through peace rather than power, only to be silenced for her efforts. Alina found herself making a quiet promise in the dark, half-formed and uncertain, that whatever happened next, she would not let that woman's hope die entirely unrealized. If there was any chance at all to break the cycle that had claimed so much from both their families, she intended to see it through, whatever the cost turned out to be. 2 weeks after the storm, the quiet routine that had settled over Voss Hall shattered with a single piece of news carried in by a merchant passing through the region. Grady brought word to Alaric's study just after midday, his usually composed face tight with concern. "My lord, there are riders posted at every crossroads within a day's ride of here. Lord Draven has announced a formal search for his niece, claiming she was taken against her will on the night of her wedding. He is offering a considerable reward for any information leading to her recovery, and warning that anyone found sheltering her without reporting it will be treated as an accomplice to her disappearance." Alaric set down the papers he had been reviewing, his expression darkening. "He is calling it an abduction. That is the story being spread, my lord. That his niece was taken from the wedding celebration by unknown persons, likely for ransom or political leverage, and that he fears greatly for her safety." Grady's tone made clear exactly what he thought of that particular version of events. "It is, of course, a far more sympathetic story than the truth, and one far more likely to bring the full weight of the region's other noble houses to his side in the search." "Clever," Alaric muttered, though there was no admiration in the word, only grim recognition of the danger it represented. "If Alina is found now, whoever finds her will believe they are rescuing her from captors, not returning her to the very man who arranged for her death once she had served her purpose." "There is more, my lord." Grady hesitated slightly before continuing. "Lord Draven has specifically mentioned House Voss in his search efforts, citing our recent difficult negotiations as grounds for suspicion. He has requested permission to send men to search our lands directly, framing it as a reasonable precaution given the history of tension between our families." Alaric's hands curled into fists on the desk in front of him. "He suspects. Or he is simply casting as wide a net as possible, hoping to provoke a reaction from any household with reason to resent him," Grady offered, though his tone suggested he did not fully believe his own reassurance. "Either way, my lord, we must decide quickly how to respond. Refusing his request outright will only deepen his suspicion. Allowing his men onto our lands risks discovery entirely." Alaric was quiet for a long moment, his mind working through the narrowing set of options available to them. Finally, he stood, moving toward the window that overlooked the snow-covered grounds below. Send word that we will permit a limited search of the outer estate, the stables, the tenant farms, anywhere a fleeing traveler might reasonably have sought shelter without our knowledge. We will not permit access to the main house itself, citing the private nature of family quarters and ongoing matters unrelated to this search. It is a reasonable boundary that any household would be within its rights to set. And if he pushes further, then we will cross that bridge when we reach it, Alaric said grimly. For now, we buy what time we can. When Alaric brought this news to Alina that evening, she received it with a calm that surprised him, though he suspected the calm was more a matter of exhaustion than true composure. She had been growing stronger physically each day, but the weight of constant fear had begun to show in the hollows beneath her eyes, and the way her hands never seemed to fully stop trembling, even in quiet moments. "He is telling everyone I was taken," she said softly, staring into the fire rather than at Alaric as he relayed the details Grady had brought. "That someone abducted me from my own wedding." "Yes. That is almost worse than if he had simply reported me missing," Alina said, a bitter edge entering her voice. "If I am found now, whoever finds me will see themselves as my rescuer, will expect gratitude, will return me to my uncle believing they have done a great and noble thing. No one will think to question whether I wanted to be found at all." "I know," Alaric said quietly, moving to sit across from her. "It is a dangerous story he has crafted, precisely because it makes any effort you might make to protect yourself look like further evidence of trauma from your supposed captivity, rather than a reasonable response to a genuine threat." Alina pressed her hands against her eyes, and for a moment Alaric feared she might finally break entirely under the accumulated weight of everything she had endured. But when she lowered her hands, her expression had hardened into something more determined than defeated. "Then we need proof, real proof, not simply my own account of what I overheard that night, something that cannot be explained away or twisted into further evidence of my supposed instability." "What kind of proof would satisfy that?" Alina considered the question carefully. "The marriage contract itself, perhaps. If my uncle drafted specific terms transferring my inheritance to Edmund upon the marriage's completion, with provisions that reverted everything fully to my uncle's control under certain conditions, that would demonstrate motive clearly enough that even skeptical eyes might reconsider the official story. Would such a document exist somewhere accessible? Surely your uncle would have taken care to keep something so incriminating well hidden." "He is careful," Alina admitted, "but he is also proud, and prideful men often keep records of their own cleverness even when discretion would serve them better. My uncle has always kept a private study within our family estate, separate from the main household records, where he handles matters he does not wish shared even with his own household staff. I do not know exactly what is kept there, but I would wager the true terms of the marriage contract, along with whatever other schemes he has been orchestrating over the years, are locked within it." Alaric studied her for a long moment, understanding dawning slowly and uneasily in his expression. "You are suggesting we retrieve documents from inside your uncle's own estate, while his men are actively searching the countryside for you. I am suggesting that hiding here indefinitely, waiting for either discovery or some miracle to resolve this situation on its own, is not a strategy that will end well for either of us," Alina said firmly. "My uncle will not stop searching. Every day I remain hidden is another day closer to the moment his men find something, some clue, some slip in caution that leads them directly to your door. We need to act, not simply wait." "It is an enormous risk," Alaric said slowly. "If you were caught anywhere near your uncle's estate, especially inside it, there would be no story sympathetic enough to explain your presence there. He would have every justification to claim whatever punishment he wished, and no one would question it." "I am aware of the risk," Alina said, meeting his gaze steadily. "But I am also aware that continuing to hide accomplishes nothing except delaying the inevitable confrontation. I would rather face that confrontation with evidence in hand than wait helplessly for it to find me on its own terms." Alaric was quiet for a long time, weighing the courage in her words against the very real danger such a plan would involve. Finally, he spoke, his voice careful but resolute. If we do this, we do it together, and we do it with far more planning than simply walking into your uncle's estate and hoping for the best. I have people I trust, contacts within the region who owe me favors, and know how to move quietly without drawing attention. We will need time to prepare properly. How much time? A week, perhaps less if fortune favors us, Alaric said. In the meantime, we continue managing the search efforts here as carefully as we have been, and we begin gathering whatever information we can about your uncle's household, his current schedule, the layout of his estate, anything that might reduce the risk once we do attempt this. Alina nodded, some of the tension in her shoulders easing slightly now that they had a plan taking shape, rather than simply reacting to whatever news Grady brought each day. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for believing this is worth attempting, rather than simply telling me to remain hidden and hope for the best. I believe in facing threats directly rather than allowing them to fester unaddressed," Alaric said. "And I believe, more than that you deserve the chance to reclaim your own future rather than simply surviving whatever fate others have decided for you." Over the following days, the household at Voss Hall settled into a careful new rhythm, balancing the ordinary business of managing a great estate with the quiet, urgent work of preparing for something far more dangerous. Grady made discreet inquiries among trusted contacts in the region, gathering fragments of information about the Draven estate's current arrangements, the placement of guards, the routines of the household staff who might unknowingly provide opportunities or obstacles. Alina, though still not permitted to venture far from the private wing of the house, spent hours each day sketching what she remembered of her uncle's estate from memory, marking the location of his private study, the servants' quarters, the paths least likely to be watched closely during the ongoing search efforts that had every guard on high alert for outsiders rather than familiar faces slipping quietly through familiar halls. Alaric, for his part, found himself increasingly torn between the careful, calculated planning the situation demanded, and a growing, more personal fear that had nothing to do with strategy at all. Watching Alina grow stronger each day, watching her courage steady into something formidable despite everything she had endured, he found himself dreading the moment their plan would require her to walk directly back into the danger she had barely escaped. "You do not have to come with me," he told her one evening, as they reviewed her latest sketch of the estate's layout by candlelight. "I could send trusted men in your place, working from the information you have already provided. There is no need for you to risk yourself directly." "There is every need," Alina said firmly, not looking up from the sketch in front of her. "I know that estate better than any man you could send, know which floorboards creak, which servants can be trusted to look the other way, which guards are lazy enough to be avoided easily, and which are sharp enough to require real caution. More than that, if we are caught, I would rather be caught fighting for my own future than hiding safely here while others take the risks on my behalf." Alaric studied her for a long moment, something complicated moving behind his eyes that he did not fully voice. "You are remarkable, you know. Most people, after everything you have survived, would want nothing more than to remain as far from danger as possible. Most people have not had their entire future stolen and rewritten by men who see them as nothing more than an inconvenient obstacle to their own ambitions," Alina said quietly. "I am done being someone else's obstacle to remove or tool to use. Whatever comes next, I intend to have some say in it." The candlelight flickered between them, and for a moment neither spoke, the weight of everything unsaid settling comfortably rather than awkwardly into the quiet space of the room. Finally, Alaric reached across the small table separating them, his hand covering hers briefly, a small gesture that carried far more than its simplicity suggested. "Then we will face it together," he said, "whatever happens." Alina did not pull her hand away. Outside, the search for her continued across the countryside, growing more urgent with each passing day. But within the walls of Voss Hall, something quieter and steadier had begun taking root. A partnership built not on the old hatreds of their families, but on shared courage and a growing, careful trust that neither of them was quite ready to name, though both could feel it settling into place. as certain and undeniable as the winter still holding the world outside in its grip. The night they chose to move against the Draven estate was moonless, the sky thick with clouds that promised more snow before morning. Alaric had selected it deliberately, knowing the darkness would work in their favor even as it made the journey itself more treacherous. He and Alina rode out from Voss Hall just after midnight, accompanied by two men Alaric trusted absolutely, both former soldiers who had served his family for years and who knew how to move silently through unfamiliar terrain. Alina had changed out of the borrowed gowns she had worn during her recovery and into simple, dark clothing better suited for the task ahead, her hair braided tightly back, and a hood pulled low over her face. She looked, Alaric thought as they rode through the frozen dark, nothing at all like the fragile, half-frozen woman he had carried out of the snow weeks before. There was steel in her now, forged by fear and necessity, and it showed in the set of her shoulders and the steady grip she kept on her horse's reins. "Once we are inside the walls," Alaric said quietly as they approached the outer boundary of the Draven estate, its dark towers barely visible against the clouded sky, "you lead. You know the layout better than any of us. I will follow your direction, but the moment anything feels wrong, we retreat immediately. No hesitation, no attempts to salvage the mission if the risk grows too great. Do you understand?" "I understand," Alina said, though her voice carried a tightness that betrayed the fear she was working hard to control. They left the horses with one of Alaric's men at a small copse of trees a safe distance from the main gate, out of sight of the guards posted along the estate's perimeter. The second man, a quiet, capable soldier named Fen, moved with them toward a narrow servants' entrance on the estate's eastern side, a door Alina remembered from childhood visits, one that had always been left unlocked for the kitchen staff who rose before dawn to begin preparing the household's meals. The door, when they reached it, was locked. "They have increased security since the search began," Alina whispered, her breath fogging in the cold night air. "This was always left open when I lived here." "Can you find another way in?" Alaric asked, glancing back toward the shadowed tree line where the guards' torches flickered in the distance. Alina's mind raced, sifting through years of childhood memory for any other point of entry she might have overlooked. "There is a low window along the western wall, near the old wine cellar. It was never properly secured because my uncle believed no one would think to look for an entrance there. It may still be unguarded." They moved carefully along the estate's outer wall, staying low and close to the shadows, pausing whenever the distant sound of guards' footsteps or muffled conversation drifted toward them on the cold wind. The window, when they found it, was indeed unlocked, though narrow enough that Fen had to remain outside as lookout while Alaric and Alina squeezed through into the darkness of the wine cellar beyond. The interior of the estate was as familiar to Alina as it was foreign to Alaric, and she moved through the dark corridors with a quiet confidence that came from years of navigating these halls as a child, slipping past the occasional sleepy servant or dozing guard with practiced ease. Alaric followed close behind her, his hand never far from the blade at his hip, every sense alert to any sign that their presence had been noticed. They reached her uncle's private study without incident, though Alina's hands trembled as she worked the lock with a small tool Grady had procured for exactly this purpose. The lock gave way with a soft click that seemed impossibly loud in the silent house, and they slipped inside, closing the door carefully behind them before risking the light of a small, carefully shielded lantern. The study was exactly as Alina remembered it, dominated by a heavy desk and rows of locked cabinets along one wall. "The marriage contract, if it exists in its true form, will likely be kept in the cabinet behind the desk," she whispered, moving quickly toward it. "My uncle always kept his most sensitive papers there, separate from the general household records." The cabinet, too, was locked, but Alina produced a small key from a hidden pocket in her sleeve, one she had kept hidden throughout her recovery at Voss Hall, never mentioning it to anyone until this exact moment. "You had a key this whole time?" Alaric asked, surprised. "I took it from my uncle's ring the night I fled, without fully knowing why," Alina admitted, working the lock carefully. "Some instinct told me it might matter eventually." The cabinet opened to reveal neat stacks of documents, and Alina worked quickly, sorting through them with practiced efficiency while Alaric kept watch at the door. It took several tense minutes before she found what they had come for, a formal contract bearing her uncle's seal and Edmund's signature, its terms laid out in precise, damning legal language that left no room for innocent interpretation. "Here," she breathed, holding the document up toward the lantern light. "The land reverts fully to my uncle's control within 1 year of the marriage, regardless of my own survival or circumstances. There is even a clause here, disguised in careful legal wording, that outlines provisions for the estate's management should I become, and this is the exact phrase used, unable to fulfill my duties as lady of the house due to unforeseen circumstances. That is as close to a written confession of intent as we could have hoped for," Alaric said grimly, moving closer to examine the document himself. "Take it, and anything else that might support our case. We need to move quickly now." Alina gathered the contract along with several other papers that caught her attention, correspondence between her uncle and Edmund that hinted at similar schemes involving other family holdings, evidence of a pattern far larger than her own situation alone. She had just tucked the last of the documents into the pouch at her waist when the sound of footsteps in the corridor outside froze them both in place. "Someone is coming," Alaric whispered, extinguishing the lantern immediately, plunging the room into darkness broken only by thin moonlight filtering through heavy curtains. They pressed themselves against the wall beside the door as footsteps grew louder, pausing directly outside. Alina's heart pounded so violently she was certain it could be heard through the door itself. The handle turned slowly, and for one horrifying moment she was certain they had been discovered. But the footsteps continued past, moving on down the corridor toward some other destination, and the sound gradually faded into silence once more. Alina let out a breath she had not realized she was holding, her hands shaking as she pressed them against her mouth to keep from making any further sound. "We need to leave now," Alaric whispered, and Alina nodded, following him back through the dark corridors toward the window they had entered through, moving faster now, urgency overtaking caution as every shadow seemed to hold the possibility of discovery. They were nearly back to the wine cellar when a sudden shout echoed through the house behind them, followed immediately by the sound of multiple footsteps breaking into a run. Someone had discovered the study's disturbed papers, or perhaps simply noticed the unlocked window, but whatever the cause, their presence had been discovered. "Run," Alaric said, grabbing Alina's hand and pulling her forward through the cellar toward the window. He boosted her through first, following immediately after, and they sprinted across the dark grounds toward the tree line where Fen and the horses waited, the shouts behind them growing louder, torches beginning to bob through the darkness as guards spread out across the estate grounds in search of the intruders. They reached the horses just as the first guards emerged from the estate's main gate, and Alaric practically threw Alina onto her horse before mounting his own, the four of them kicking their mounts into a full gallop away from the estate, away from the shouting and the torches, and the danger closing in behind them. Alina did not look back, focusing every ounce of her attention on staying seated as her horse thundered through the dark countryside, branches whipping past dangerously close in the moonless night. They did not slow their pace until the lights of the Draven estate had long since disappeared behind them, swallowed by darkness and distance, and even then, Alaric kept them moving at a brisk pace for another hour, taking a deliberately winding route back toward Voss Hall to ensure they were not followed. By the time they finally arrived back at the safety of Alaric's own estate, exhaustion had replaced the sharp adrenaline that had carried Alina through the danger of the night, and she nearly collapsed from her horse before Alaric caught her, steadying her with strong arms that had become, over the past weeks, increasingly familiar and increasingly welcome. "We did it," she said, half laughing, half weeping with the release of tension finally allowed to break free. "We actually did it." "You did it," Alaric corrected gently, guiding her toward the house as the first hints of dawn began to lighten the eastern sky. "Your knowledge, your courage, your memory of every hidden passage and unlocked door." I simply followed where you led. They settled in the small library once inside. The documents spread carefully across the table between them as the household slowly began to stir with the arrival of morning. But even as relief and quiet triumph filled the room, Alina's expression grew troubled as the full weight of what they had accomplished, and what it meant for the danger still facing them, settled fully into place. They know now that someone broke in, she said quietly. They will suspect immediately that it was connected to my disappearance, and it will not take my uncle long to consider House Voss among his suspects, especially given your recent negotiations with him. I know, Alaric said, his own expression sobering as the adrenaline of their escape faded into more careful consideration of what came next. This will likely accelerate whatever confrontation was already coming. We should assume he will act quickly now, rather than continuing to search patiently. Alina was quiet for a long moment, staring at the damning documents spread across the table, evidence of her uncle's cruelty finally within their grasp, but the danger surrounding them now sharper and more immediate than ever before. Perhaps I should leave, she said finally, her voice carrying a heaviness that surprised Alaric. Take these documents somewhere else, somewhere that cannot be connected to your household. I have already put you and everyone here at far greater risk than I ever intended. If my uncle suspects House Voss is harboring me, the consequences for your family could be severe, whatever the truth of these documents eventually proves. No, Alaric said, the word coming out sharper and more immediate than he perhaps intended, and Alina looked up, startled by the intensity in his voice. He softened slightly, though the firmness in his expression did not waver. I did not pull you from that snow to abandon you the moment the danger grew serious, Alina. I have known from the beginning that helping you would carry real risk to my own household. That knowledge has not changed simply because we now hold proof of your uncle's true intentions. But if something happens to your family because of me, then it happens because I chose to do what was right, not because you forced anything upon me, Alaric said firmly, moving to sit beside her rather than across from her, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him even through the lingering cold of their long ride. I told you once that you mattered, and I meant it far more than I perhaps let myself acknowledge fully at the time. I am not willing to simply hand you over to danger now, not after everything we have survived together to get this far. Alina studied his face in the pale light of early morning, searching for any hint of obligation or duty alone behind his words, and finding instead something far warmer, something that had been growing quietly between them since the very first night he had carried her, half frozen, through his own front doors. Alaric, she said softly, using his given name for the first time without any title attached to it, I do not know how to properly thank you for everything you have done. For finding me, for believing me, for risking so much on behalf of a stranger who belonged, by every measure your family had reason to expect, to your enemy's side of this feud. You stopped being simply a Draven the moment I understood who you truly were, Alaric said quietly, reaching to gently brush a strand of hair back from her face, the gesture careful and tender in a way that made Alina's breath catch. You are Alina, brave, resourceful, kinder than anyone who has treated you as they have deserves from you in return. Whatever comes next, whatever danger your uncle brings to our door, I intend to face it standing beside you, not watching you walk into it alone. The space between them had grown small without either of them quite noticing how it happened, and for a long moment neither moved, the weight of everything unsaid finally settling into something neither could deny any longer. When Alaric finally leaned forward, closing the last small distance between them, Alina did not pull away, meeting him instead with a certainty that surprised her even as it felt like the most natural thing in the world. Outside, the sun rose fully over the frozen countryside, casting pale gold light across snow-covered fields that had witnessed, over the past weeks, the quiet unraveling of old hatreds and the fragile, determined beginning of something entirely new. But even as warmth grew steadily between them within the walls of Voss Hall, both Alina and Alaric understood, without needing to voice it aloud, that the danger gathering beyond those walls had not lessened in the slightest, and that the true confrontation with everything they had risked so much to uncover was still, inevitably, waiting for them. The confrontation came sooner than either of them expected. Only 2 days after the break-in at the Draven estate, a rider arrived at Voss Hall's gates just before dusk, this time making no pretense of routine inquiry. Lord Edmund Draven himself sat astride a dark horse just beyond the gate, flanked by a dozen armed men, his expression cold and furious even from a distance. "He knows," Grady said grimly, watching from the window of Alaric's study as the party assembled outside the gates. "There is no other reason he would come here himself, with armed men, rather than sending another quiet inquiry." Alaric's jaw tightened as he watched the scene unfold below. "Have the gates held, but do not provoke him further. I will go speak with him myself." "My lord is that wise. If he has come prepared for confrontation. If I refuse to face him directly, it will only confirm whatever suspicions he already carries," Alaric said, already moving toward the door. "Better to control the conversation than to hide from it." Alina caught his arm before he could leave the room, her face pale but her eyes steady. "Let me come with you." "Absolutely not," Alaric said immediately. "If he sees you, there will be no more room for careful negotiation. He will simply demand your return, and I do not know that I could refuse him outright without triggering exactly the kind of open conflict we have been trying to avoid. Then I will stay out of sight, but I will not simply hide upstairs while you face him alone on my account," Alina insisted. "Let me at least be close enough to intervene if things go badly." Alaric hesitated, torn between his instinct to protect her and his growing respect for her refusal to simply be shielded from danger while others fought her battles for her. Finally, he nodded. "Stay in the gatehouse, out of sight but close enough to hear what is said. If I signal for you, and only if I signal for you, you may come forward. Otherwise, you remain hidden whatever happens." Alina agreed, though the tightness in her expression made clear how difficult that promise would be to keep if the confrontation turned dangerous. Alaric walked out to meet Edmund at the gate alone, his posture deliberately calm despite the tension coiled tightly beneath his composed exterior. "Lord Draven," he said, keeping his voice even. "This is an unexpected visit and an unusually well-armed one for a simple social call." "Do not insult me with pleasantries, Voss," Edmund said, his voice sharp with barely contained anger. 2 nights ago, someone broke into Lord Draven's private study and stole documents of a highly sensitive nature. The intruders escaped on horseback, riding in the direction of your lands. I find it difficult to believe that is mere coincidence, given your recent dealings with the family and the timing of my missing bride's disappearance. "I am not aware of any documents stolen from anyone's private study," Alaric said, keeping his tone carefully neutral. "As for your missing bride, I have offered every courtesy already extended to your search efforts, permitting inspection of my outer lands, despite the inconvenience and insult of being treated as a suspect in a matter that has nothing to do with my household." "Then you will not object to a more thorough search this time," Edmund said, his eyes narrowing with barely restrained hostility. "Of the main house itself, not merely the outer grounds." "I will object, actually," Alaric said, his voice hardening slightly despite his effort to remain composed. "My private residence is not subject to search by outside parties without significant cause you have not yet provided beyond suspicion and coincidence. I have cooperated within reason. I will not simply open my household to armed men on nothing more than your accusations." Edmund's expression darkened further, and for a moment Alaric feared the confrontation might tip immediately into open violence, the armed men behind Edmund shifting restlessly in their saddles as tension crackled through the cold evening air. But Edmund seemed to reconsider, pulling back slightly, his voice dropping into something colder and more calculating. "You misunderstand the position you are in, Voss. Alina Draven is my bride, taken from her own wedding under circumstances that grow more suspicious with every passing day. If she is found within your walls, sheltered against her family's wishes, that will be seen by every noble house in this region as an act of aggression. A declaration that House Voss has chosen to insert itself into affairs that do not concern it, at the cost of whatever fragile peace still exists between our families. And if she was never taken against her will at all, Alaric countered, his voice steady despite the danger of the words he was about to speak. But fled a marriage she discovered was arranged not for her benefit, but for her uncle's gain, with terms that would have stripped her of everything, including, eventually, her own life. Would that change the story you are so determined to tell every noble house in this region? Edmund went very still, his eyes narrowing sharply. That is a dangerous accusation to make without proof, Voss. Is it an accusation, or simply a question worth considering? Alaric asked calmly. I have not confirmed anything about Alina's whereabouts. I'm merely curious why a man so determined to recover his supposedly kidnapped bride has not once, in all his public statements, expressed concern for whether she might have left of her own accord, for reasons entirely of her own. The silence that followed was heavy, dangerous, both men understanding fully the weight of what had just been implied without being directly stated. Finally, Edmund spoke again, his voice low and cold. Whatever games you believe you are playing, Voss, understand this clearly. If I discover that House Voss has been sheltering Alina Draven against my family's wishes, I will not hesitate to bring this matter before every noble house in the region, framing it exactly as the aggression it would represent. Your family has already lost enough to conflict with mine. I would think carefully before risking more. The reference to Alaric's mother, oblique as it was, landed like a blow, and Alaric felt old grief and fresh anger rise sharply in his chest. But he kept his composure, refusing to give Edmund the satisfaction of a visible reaction. Careful consideration has never been something my family lacked, Lord Draven. Perhaps it is your own family that would benefit from more of it. Given how quickly your uncle's ambitions seem to have led you into arrangements you now find yourself desperately trying to salvage. Edmund's horse shifted restlessly beneath him as his composure finally cracked slightly, fury flashing openly across his features before he forced it back under control. You will regret this conversation, Voss. Mark my words. I will find proof of whatever you are hiding, and when I do, there will be no careful negotiations left to have. He wheeled his horse around sharply, his men following as he rode back the way they had come, disappearing into the gathering dusk with the same cold fury he had arrived with. Alaric remained at the gate for a long moment after they had gone, watching the empty road, his heart pounding with adrenaline he had carefully kept hidden throughout the entire tense exchange. Alina emerged from the gatehouse the moment the riders were safely out of sight, her face pale, her hands trembling slightly as she approached him. You baited him, she said, something like awe mixed with fear in her voice. You practically told him I am here. I told him nothing directly, Alaric said, though the weight of what he had risked settled heavily over him now that the confrontation had passed. But you are right, I pushed harder than perhaps was wise. I wanted him to understand that we are not simply hiding in fear, that we have questions of our own, and perhaps evidence to support them. He will come back, Alina said quietly, with more men and less patience for careful diplomatic exchanges. I know. Alaric turned to face her fully, his expression grave. Alina, I think the time has come to move faster than we originally planned. We have the documents. We have evidence of your uncle's true intentions. Waiting longer only gives Edmund more time to prepare his own response, more time to twist the narrative further in his favor before we have the chance to present the truth publicly. Then what do you propose? A gathering, Alaric said slowly, the shape of an idea forming even as he spoke it aloud for the first time. The Regional Council of Noble Houses meets in less than a week for their annual winter assembly, a gathering where matters affecting the entire region are discussed openly, before witnesses from every major family. If we present the evidence there, publicly, before an audience too large and too influential for your uncle to simply dismiss or silence, it becomes far more difficult for him to maintain his current story. Alina's eyes widened at the boldness of the plan. That would mean revealing everything publicly before every noble family in the region. There would be no going back from that, no quiet resolution behind closed doors. No, Alaric agreed, there would not. But I do not believe a quiet resolution is possible any longer, not after tonight, not with Edmund's suspicions already fully aroused. Better to control how and when the truth comes out than to wait for him to force a confrontation on his own terms, with a story already shaped entirely to his advantage. Alina considered this for a long moment, fear and determination warring visibly across her features. Finally, she nodded, steel settling once more into her expression. Then let us prepare. If I am going to face my uncle and Edmund before the entire regional council, I want to be ready for every question, every accusation they might attempt to throw at me. You will not face them alone, Alaric said firmly, taking her hand in his own, the gesture steady and certain despite the uncertainty of everything still ahead of them. Whatever happens at that assembly, we face it together, exactly as we have faced everything since the night I found you in the snow. Alina's fingers tightened around his, drawing strength from the steadiness of his presence even as fear for what was coming continued to churn beneath her calm exterior. Outside, night had fully fallen over Voss Hall, the temporary safety of its walls now feeling far more fragile than it had even a day before. But within those walls, resolve had replaced hesitation, and as the household began final preparations for the confrontation awaiting them at the winter assembly, both Alina and Alaric understood that the quiet, careful days of hiding were finally, irrevocably, coming to an end. The great hall where the regional council gathered each winter had never seen a crowd quite so tense as the one assembled beneath its high, vaulted ceilings on the day Alaric and Alina arrived. Noble families from every corner of the region filled the long benches, their conversations hushed, but charged with the particular energy that came from knowing something significant was about to unfold, even if most of them did not yet understand exactly what. Lord Draven and Edmund sat near the front of the hall, close to where the regional council's senior members would preside over the day's proceedings, and Alina felt her uncle's eyes find her the moment she and Alaric entered through the great doors at the back of the hall. His expression, carefully controlled for the benefit of the watching crowd, could not fully hide the flash of fury and calculation that crossed his features at the sight of his supposedly kidnapped niece walking freely into the assembly, very much alive and very much unharmed. "Steady," Alaric murmured beside her, his hand resting lightly at the small of her back as they made their way toward seats near the front, deliberately positioned where they could not be ignored or overlooked once the proceedings began. "Whatever he tries first, remember we have prepared for this." The morning's business proceeded through several minor regional matters, trade disputes and boundary questions that held little of the tension gathering beneath the surface of the room. But as the afternoon session began, Alaric rose from his seat, requesting formal recognition from the council's presiding elder to address a matter of significant concern to the entire region. "The council recognizes Duke Alaric Voss," the presiding elder said, and a ripple of curious attention moved through the assembled nobles as Alaric stepped forward to address the full gathering. "Honored council and fellow houses," Alaric began, his voice carrying clearly through the hushed hall. "I come before you today regarding a matter that has recently touched both my own household and that of House Draven. A matter I believe concerns the safety and integrity of noble governance throughout this entire region, not merely the two families directly involved." Lord Draven rose immediately from his seat, his voice sharp with barely restrained fury. "If this concerns my niece's disappearance, Voss, I would remind the council that I have already filed formal complaint regarding suspicious activity connecting House Voss to her abduction. Perhaps the Duke intends to finally offer confession rather than continued deflection." Murmurs rippled through the crowd at this direct accusation, and Alina felt her heart pound as every eye in the hall shifted between her uncle and Alaric. But Alaric remained calm, unshaken by the interruption. "I would welcome the opportunity to address exactly that concern, Lord Draven, and I believe the council will find the true circumstances rather different from the story you have been telling throughout this region." Alaric turned to address the presiding elder directly. With the council's permission, I would like to call forward the woman at the center of these events, so that she might speak for herself regarding what truly happened on the night of her supposed abduction. The presiding elder, an older woman with sharp eyes that missed little of the tension in the room, nodded slowly. The council grants permission. Let her speak. Alina rose from her seat, aware of every gaze in the hall fixing upon her as she made her way to stand beside Alaric before the assembled nobility. Her hands trembled slightly, but her voice, when she finally spoke, remained steady, drawing on every reserve of courage she had gathered over the difficult weeks since her escape. "Honored council," she began, "I did not leave my wedding because I was taken against my will by any outside party. I fled my own wedding alone, because I discovered the true purpose behind the marriage my uncle had arranged for me, a purpose that had nothing to do with securing my future and everything to do with securing my inheritance for himself, with provisions for my eventual removal once that inheritance had been fully transferred." Gasps and murmurs spread through the hall, and Lord Draven's face flushed with fury. "Lies," he snarled, rising fully to his feet. "The girl is clearly distressed, confused after whatever ordeal she truly suffered. This council should not entertain such wild accusations without proof." "I have proof," Alina said, her voice gaining strength even as her uncle's fury grew more visible before the watching assembly. She produced the marriage contract they had recovered, holding it up for the council to see. "This is the true marriage contract, bearing my uncle's own seal, outlining terms that would have transferred my family's land fully into his control within 1 year of the marriage, regardless of my own survival, with specific provisions addressing what my uncle termed my potential unavailability to fulfill my duties as lady of the house." The presiding elder gestured for the document to be brought forward, and a tense silence fell over the hall as council members examined the contract carefully, comparing seals and signatures against known records to verify its authenticity. Lord Draven's composure cracked visibly as the examination proceeded, sweat beading at his brow despite the cold of the hall. "This document proves nothing beyond standard inheritance planning," Edmund interjected, rising to stand beside Lord Draven, though his voice carried less confidence than he clearly intended. "Such arrangements are common practice among noble families managing complex succession matters. Common practice does not typically include provisions anticipating a bride's death within the marriage's first year," Alaric said sharply, stepping forward. "Nor does it typically require a niece to flee her own wedding into a blizzard, risking her life rather than remain under her own family's roof. I found Alina Draven half frozen and near death on my lands the night of her supposed wedding, her wrists bound with rope, having escaped through a window rather than face whatever fate her uncle and his chosen heir had truly planned for her." The presiding elder's expression had grown increasingly grave as the evidence continued to mount before the assembly. "Lord Draven," she said finally, her voice cutting through the murmurs that had spread throughout the hall, "the council will require a full accounting of these accusations, with opportunity for you to respond directly to each point raised. But I will say plainly that the evidence presented thus far raises grave concerns that this council cannot simply dismiss." Lord Draven's carefully maintained composure finally shattered entirely under the weight of the assembly's growing suspicion. "You would take the word of a frightened girl and her vast protector over the standing and reputation I have built within this region for decades," he demanded, his voice rising with barely controlled desperation. "This is nothing more than a scheme by House Voss to embarrass and weaken my family, using my own niece as their instrument." "If that were true," Alaric said calmly, "I would ask the council to consider why Alina's own testimony matches so precisely the terms outlined in a document she could not possibly have forged herself, given that it bears your own seal, recovered from your own private study." "You broke into my home," Lord Draven snarled, momentarily forgetting himself in his fury. "You had no right." He stopped abruptly, realizing too late what his own outburst had just confirmed before the entire assembled council, that the document was genuine, that his fury was not simply at false accusation, but at the unwelcome exposure of a truth he had worked hard to keep hidden. The hall fell utterly silent, every noble family present understanding fully now the weight of what had just been revealed. The presiding elder's voice, when she finally spoke again, carried the full authority of the regional council behind it. "Lord Draven, your reaction just now has confirmed rather more than I believe you intended. This council will convene a formal investigation into the circumstances surrounding this marriage arrangement, and into your management of your niece's inheritance more broadly. Until that investigation concludes, I would strongly advise against any further attempt to pursue claims against House Voss regarding Alina Draven's whereabouts, given the very serious questions now raised regarding your own conduct." Lord Draven stood frozen for a long moment, the full weight of his public exposure settling visibly over him as murmurs of disapproval and quiet condemnation spread through the assembled nobility around him. Edmund, beside him, had gone pale, understanding fully that whatever ambitions he had built upon his patron's schemes had just crumbled entirely before the very audience whose respect and legitimacy he had hoped to secure through the marriage. Without another word, Lord Draven turned and strode from the hall, Edmund following quickly behind him, the two men's hurried departure speaking louder than any further protest could have managed. The regional council watched them go in heavy silence, and then, slowly, attention turned back toward Alina and Alaric, standing together at the front of the hall. "Alina Draven," the presiding elder said gently, "the council recognizes the great courage it took to bring this matter before us today, and the great danger you faced in doing so. You have this council's support and its protection as the investigation into your uncle's conduct proceeds. Your inheritance and your safety will be secured under the council's direct oversight until matters are fully resolved." Alina felt tears finally slip free, no longer tears of fear but of overwhelming relief, the weight of weeks of danger and uncertainty finally beginning to lift from her shoulders. "Thank you," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I did not know when I climbed out that window into the storm whether I would survive the night, let alone whether the truth would ever be believed. I am deeply grateful to this council and to Duke Voss for making this moment possible." The assembly slowly began to disperse following the dramatic proceedings, small clusters of noble families murmuring among themselves about the stunning turn of events they had just witnessed, the fall of House Draven's carefully constructed reputation unfolding before their very eyes. Alaric guided Alina gently away from the crowd, finding a quiet alcove where they could finally breathe after the tension of the confrontation. "You did it," Alaric said softly, watching the color slowly return to her face as relief replaced fear. "You stood before the entire regional council and told the truth, despite everything your uncle might have tried to do in response." "We did it," Alina corrected gently, echoing the words he had spoken to her after their escape from her uncle's estate weeks before. "I could not have gathered that evidence alone, could not have found the courage to speak before that entire hall, without you standing beside me through every step of this." Alaric reached out, gently brushing away the last of the tears still clinging to her cheeks, his expression carrying a tenderness that had grown steadily over the weeks since he had first found her in the snow. "Alina, I have thought a great deal about what comes next, for both of us, now that the immediate danger has finally passed. I do not wish for whatever we have built together these past weeks to simply fade once the excitement of today settles into ordinary life again." Alina's breath caught, understanding beginning to dawn in her expression as Alaric continued, his voice steady despite the vulnerability clear in his words. "I do not know what the future holds for the relationship between our two families, whether the old wounds between House Voss and House Draven can ever be fully healed, especially with your uncle's fate still uncertain before this council's investigation. But I know what I want for my own future, and it involves you, standing beside me not as an obligation born from the night I found you in the storm, but as a choice I make freely, with my whole heart." He knelt then, right there in the quiet alcove away from the dispersing crowd, and Alina felt her heart swell with an emotion she had never expected to feel again after the horror of her arranged marriage, something warm and certain and entirely her own to claim. "Alina," Alaric said softly, "will you marry me? Not for land, not for inheritance, not to settle any feud or secure any alliance, but simply because I have come to love you deeply and completely, and I cannot imagine facing whatever comes next in my life without you beside me." Tears fell freely now as Alina knelt down to meet him, taking his hands in her own, her answer coming without hesitation. "Yes," she said, laughing through her tears, the word carrying every ounce of joy and relief and love that had been building quietly within her since the night he had carried her, half frozen, into the warmth and safety of his own home. "Yes, Alaric, I will marry you gladly, freely, and with my whole heart in return." Outside the great hall, the winter sun broke briefly through heavy clouds, casting warm light across snow-covered grounds that had witnessed, over the preceding weeks, the quiet, remarkable unraveling of an old and bitter feud, replaced now by the fragile, hopeful beginning of something entirely new. Word of the day's dramatic events would spread quickly throughout the region, carried by every noble family who had witnessed the truth finally exposed before the full council. And in the months that followed, the story would be told and retold throughout the countryside, of the Duke who found his enemy's bride alone in the snow, and how what he did that night changed everything, not only for the two of them, but for the future of both their houses. Finally freed from the shadow of a hatred that had never truly belonged to them in the first place. Spring arrived slowly that year, melting the deep snow that had covered the region since the night Alina first fled into the storm, and with the thaw came the conclusion of the regional council's investigation into Lord Draven's conduct. The findings, when finally announced before the full assembly of noble houses, confirmed everything Alina had testified to and more, revealing a pattern of manipulated inheritances and quietly buried scandals stretching back years before her own ordeal began. Lord Draven was stripped of his authority over the family estate, the title and true inheritance formally restored to Alina as the rightful heir, with the council appointing a trusted steward to manage the transition, until she was ready to take full control herself. Edmund, exposed as a willing participant in the scheme, found every door in noble society closed to him, his ambitions collapsing entirely under the weight of public disgrace, and he left the region quietly within the month, never to trouble either family again. The wedding between Duke Alaric Voss and Lady Alina Draven took place in early summer, in the same great hall where the truth had first been exposed before the regional council months earlier, a deliberate choice that both of them agreed carried a fitting symmetry. The hall that had once witnessed the unraveling of old lies now filled with flowers and warm afternoon light, and every noble family in the region attended, drawn as much by curiosity about the remarkable story as by genuine goodwill toward the couple whose courage had reshaped the relationship between two houses that had been enemies for generations. Martha stood near the front of the gathered crowd, dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief she insisted was simply catching dust, though everyone who knew her well understood the depth of affection she had developed for Alina over the months of her recovery and the dangerous weeks that followed. Grady, ever composed, allowed himself a rare, genuine smile as he watched the ceremony unfold, and even young Ivy, who had kept careful watch over Alina during those early, uncertain days, found herself weeping openly with joy at how far the frightened, half-frozen woman she had once tended had come. As part of the wedding celebrations, Alina insisted on a gesture that surprised many of the assembled guests, but felt, to her and Alaric both, essential to properly honoring everything their union represented. Before the formal vows were spoken, she asked that a moment of silence be observed for Lady Isolde Voss, Alaric's mother, whose own quiet efforts toward peace between their two houses had cost her life decades before but had, in the end, planted the seed that would finally bloom into the reconciliation she had once dreamed of. Alaric's eyes were damp as the hall fell silent in his mother's honor, and he found Alina's hand in his own, grateful beyond words that she had understood, without needing to be told, how much that gesture would mean to him. The formal ceremony itself was simple by noble standards, both Alina and Alaric having agreed early on that they wanted their union to reflect genuine commitment rather than elaborate display. When Alaric finally slipped the ring onto Alina's finger, sealing their vows before the assembled witnesses, a warmth spread through the hall that had nothing to do with the summer sun streaming through the tall windows, a sense among everyone present that they were witnessing something rare, a genuine partnership built on courage and honesty rather than obligation or political convenience. In the years that followed, the marriage between House Voss and House Draven's rightful line became something of a legend throughout the region, told and retold as an example of how even the deepest, oldest wounds between families could eventually heal when the people involved chose honesty and courage over the comfortable patterns of inherited hatred. Alina, once she had fully assumed control of her restored inheritance, worked closely with Alaric to formally dissolve the border disputes that had fueled generations of tension between their two houses, establishing new agreements that benefited both families rather than continuing the zero-sum conflicts of the past. Their household at Voss Hall grew warmer and livelier with each passing year, filled eventually with the laughter of children who would grow up knowing nothing of the bitter feud that had once defined their parents' families, learning instead the story of how their mother had run through a blizzard to escape a cruel fate, and how their father had refused to let fear of old hatred stop him from doing what was right. Martha remained with the household well into her later years, delighting in watching the children she helped raise grow strong and curious, often telling them, with great dramatic flourish, the story of the night their mother was found nearly frozen on the northern road, a tale that never failed to leave the children wide-eyed with wonder despite having heard it told 100 times before. Alina never forgot the fear and uncertainty of those early days at Voss Hall, the constant weight of danger that had shadowed every moment of her recovery and the difficult weeks that followed. But she came, over time, to see that period of her life not simply as a story of survival, but as the foundation upon which everything good that followed had been built. The courage she had found within herself that night, climbing through a window into a blizzard rather than accepting a fate decided entirely by others, had carried her through every difficult moment since, shaping her into a woman capable of standing before an entire regional council and demanding the truth be heard, capable of building a genuine, loving partnership with a man she had once been raised to fear. Alaric, for his part, often reflected on the strange twist of fate that had placed Alina directly in his path on the very night his negotiations with her family had ended in bitter failure. He had told her once, in the early days of her recovery, that he did not know yet where the performance of noble duty ended and the true man beneath began. In the years since, watching their family grow and their two houses find genuine peace at last, he had come to understand that the answer had been simpler than he once believed. The truest measure of who he was had never been found in the careful diplomatic performances of his title, but in the single, unhesitating choice he made the night his horse stopped on a snow-covered road, refusing to leave a stranger to die simply because of the name she carried. That choice, small as it had seemed in the moment, had changed everything that followed, not only for Alina and himself, but for two entire noble houses whose generations of conflict finally found their way toward genuine and lasting peace. And whenever the story was told throughout the region in the years that followed, whether by traveling storytellers or by proud parents recounting it to their own children, it always ended the same way, with the simple truth that had guided Alaric that fateful night and every day since, that even the deepest enmity could not survive against genuine kindness, courage, and the willingness to choose what was right over what was easy, however great the risk involved in making that choice.